To understand the miracle of the HeLa cells, you first have to understand the woman they came from. Henrietta Lacks was not a scientist or a wealthy philanthropist. She was a vibrant, young African-American mother, born Loretta Pleasant in 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia. After her mother died in childbirth, her father, unable to care for his 10 children, moved the family to Clover, Virginia, where the children were distributed among relatives. Henrietta ended up living with her grandfather in a small log cabin that had once been slave quarters on a tobacco plantation. It was a life of hard work, farming the same tobacco fields that her enslaved ancestors had once worked. It was here she met and married her cousin, David "Day" Lacks. Seeking a better life and work, they moved to Turner Station, Maryland, just outside of Baltimore, a booming community for black steelworkers during World War II. Friends and family described Henrietta as a force of nature. She was beautiful, with a warm smile that could light up a room. She loved to cook, and her door was always open, her table always full for anyone who needed a meal. She loved to dance, to dress up, and above all, she fiercely loved her 5 children: Lawrence, Elsie, Sonny, Deborah, and Joe. In 1951, after the birth of her 5th child, Joseph, Henrietta began experiencing intense pain and abnormal bleeding. She went to the one place that would treat black patients in a deeply segregated Baltimore, the public wards of Johns Hopkins Hospital. The diagnosis was devastating, a particularly aggressive form of cervical cancer. The tumor was unlike anything the doctors had seen, described as a glistening purple mass. During her radiation treatments, a standard and brutal procedure for the time, a surgeon did something that was common practice, yet would have world-altering consequences. Without Henrietta's knowledge, and certainly without her consent, he sliced 2 small pieces of tissue from her cervix, one from her cancerous tumor and one from healthy tissue nearby. She had signed a standard form that said, "I hereby give consent to the staff of the Johns Hopkins Hospital to perform any operative procedures that they may deem necessary." To her, and to any reasonable person, this meant consent for her. To the hospital, in the context of the era, it was a blanket permission slip that also covered research on any material removed from her. This was standard practice, especially for patients in public wards, who were often poor and black, and were routinely used for research without their awareness, seen not as people, but as sources of raw material for science. Henrietta Lacks had no idea that a part of her had just begun a new, independent, and immortal journey. The tissue sample was sent to the lab of a prominent researcher at Johns Hopkins, Dr. George Gee. For decades, Gee, like countless scientists around the world, had been chasing a kind of holy grail: to grow human cells outside the body in a lab. The potential was enormous. If you could keep cells alive in a petri dish, you could study diseases, test drugs, and understand the basic functions of life without ever having to experiment on a living human. But every attempt had failed. Every cell sample, no matter how carefully nurtured, would die within a few days. Then, Henrietta cells arrived. They were labeled HeLa, using the first 2 letters of her first and last names, a standard practice to anonymize the source. Dr. Gee's lab assistant, Mary Kubasek, prepared the sample as she had done hundreds of times before. But this time, something was different. The next day, the cells hadn't died. In fact, they were growing. And they didn't stop. They were doubling their population every 24 hours, growing with what one scientist would later call mythological intensity. They were voracious, powerful, and seemingly unstoppable. While other cells would senesce and die after about 50 divisions, a natural limit known as the Hayflick limit, Henrietta cells just kept going. They were, for all intents and purposes, immortal. The Holy Grail had been found. The irony is as profound as it is tragic. While her cells were thriving, multiplying with incredible vitality in a lab, Henrietta's body was being ravaged by the very same aggressive cancer. The radiation treatments burned her from the inside out, but the tumors spread throughout her body. On October 4, 1951, at the age of just 31, Henrietta Lacks died in agonizing pain, and was buried in an unmarked grave in Clover, Virginia. Her family was left heartbroken, her children motherless. They had no idea that their mother, in a way, was still very much alive. The scientific revolution that followed was immediate and explosive. Dr. Gee began sharing HeLa cells with researchers all over the world, for free. The first major breakthrough came from the fight against polio, the terrifying disease that paralyzed thousands of children each year. Dr. Jonas Salk had developed a potential vaccine, but to test it, he needed a way to produce massive quantities of the polio virus in a safe, controlled environment. HeLa cells were the perfect medium. A massive HeLa factory was established at the Tuskegee Institute, and these immortal cells became the workhorses that allowed Salk to test and prove the effectiveness of his polio vaccine, saving countless lives. And that was just the beginning. HeLa cells became indispensable. They were used to understand how viruses cause cancer, which led directly to the development of the HPV vaccine that now protects millions from the very disease that killed Henrietta. They were fundamental in genetics. Scientists used them to correctly count human chromosomes for the first time, establishing we have 46, not 48. They were the first human cells ever cloned. They were sent into space on the first space missions to see how human cells would react to zero gravity. They have been instrumental in developing treatments for AIDS, herpes, influenza, and Parkinson's disease. They were used to develop in vitro fertilization. To this day, over 11,000 patents are associated with HeLa cells. They have become the bedrock of modern biology, and a multi-billion-dollar industry was built on buying and selling them. To understand the miracle of the HeLa cells, you first have to understand the woman they came from. Henrietta Lacks. Her daughter, Deborah, was haunted by the idea of her mother's ghost being endlessly experimented on. They learned that intimate details of their family's genetic makeup, derived from the HeLa cells, had been published in scientific papers for the world to see, all without their knowledge or permission. This is where the story pivots from a tale of scientific triumph to a stark examination of ethical failure. The case of Henrietta Lacks forces us to confront deeply uncomfortable questions. The concept of informed consent, the idea that a patient must be given all the relevant information to make a voluntary decision about their treatment and the use of their biological material, was a direct casualty. Her story became a cornerstone in the development of modern bioethics laws, like the Common Rule in the United States, which now requires informed consent for federally funded research. But the questions of justice and equity remain. The Lacks family never received a single penny of the billions of dollars in profit generated from their mother's cells. For decades, they couldn't even afford health insurance. The story, powerfully brought to light by Rebecca Skloot's landmark book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, highlights a painful legacy of racial inequity in medical research, where the bodies of Black people were exploited for a progress from which they were often excluded. The fight continues today. In recent years, the Lacks family has gained some measure of control, reaching agreements with institutions like the National Institutes of Health to have a say in how Henrietta's genomic data is used. In 2021, her estate filed a lawsuit against the biotech giant Thermo Fisher Scientific, arguing that the company has unjustly profited from the non-consensual use of her cells. The legacy of Henrietta Lacks is therefore a dual one. It is a story of a woman whose cells changed the world, enabling medical miracles that are nothing short of breathtaking. But it is also the story of a family's decades-long struggle for recognition, for privacy, and for justice. Henrietta Lacks is a symbol of scientific advancement, but she is also a powerful, enduring symbol of patient rights and the ongoing fight for ethical accountability in a world where our own biology can become a commodity. What are your thoughts on this complex and powerful story? Where do we draw the line between the advancement of science for the greater good and the rights of the individual? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. If you found this story as compelling as we did, Please give this video a like, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of science and history, and be sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching.